Welcome back, everybody. I'm Matt Erpelding. I'm the Vice President of Government and Community Relations for the Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce. And today I'm excited to welcome Representative Mike Moyle, the House Majority Leader, and Representative Lauren Necochea, the House Assistant Minority Leader. The two of them together will provide us with about an hour-long conversation around tax policy in Idaho. Our conversation will range from everything from tax conformity with the federal government to the grocery tax to property tax. And it should be a pretty lively conversation knowing who I'm about to interview. But before we get started, I'd just like to let everyone know that the Boise Metro Chamber is Idaho's only 5-star accredited member of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and we're very proud of that distinction. And as a result of that, we are lucky to have many, many supporting members. And today, our two supporters of this event are the Idaho Statesman and Idaho Ed News. Without our partnership with media organizations, it would be very hard for us to help legislators get their message out, and we're very grateful to their commitment to helping us provide the best possible education on current events and other issues across the valley. So with that, I'd like to welcome my two friends, Representative Lauren Necochea and Representative Mike Moyle. Representatives, it's great to see you. Before we get into any tax policy questions, Representative Necochea, how are you hanging in there? This is your second session, so you're not the green-footed one down there. How's it going?
I'm holding up all right. Yeah, so we're still in the part of the session where we have lots of big ideas and hopes and dreams for what we can accomplish, and it's really exciting, and it feels a little different by the end. A little more weary, but yeah, thanks so much for having us, Matt, and also to the sponsors.
Yeah, and Representative Moyle, this is your 28th session, so you've got a little bit different perspective. How's it going?
I wish. 28th. I'm not quite that old. I'm old though. It's going really well. It's been a weird year. It's slow. It's weird because it's quiet also with the lack of public running around and lobbyists. It's really almost surreal. It's odd. But we're going to work on slowly. Things are moving a little bit. People are a lot more cautious this year than normal, which I think is a good thing. Hopefully it will make for better legislation. But it is a different year for sure.
You know, in all seriousness, I think you're the longest serving member of the House, and you're also the longest serving majority leader, at least in modern history. What's that?
Try that again, Matt. Sorry.
No problem. I said you're the most tenured member of the House. You've been in there the longest, or close to the longest, and you're the longest serving majority leader. And in Idaho, the state of Idaho has a history of conforming to the federal tax code in an effort to simplify the books for whether it be the agricultural community or our restaurants. And there's a big discussion this year as to whether or not Idaho is going to conform with the loss carryover piece of the federal tax code. And if we don't, it will have significant impacts on our agricultural community and our restaurants. Can you speak a little bit to what the legislature is going to do and why?
Yeah, Matt, usually the legislature does conform, and in the past we have not always conformed. We didn't with, for example, bonus depreciation. The Chairman Harris introduced the bill today to conform with everything except for the 461L, or like you said, the loss carry forward. It has an impact, a one-time impact, because it allows businesses to go back and in their 18 and 19 and 20 taxes and do amended returns and pick up some revenue that they wouldn't be allowed to otherwise. The committee introduced the bill today. We'll see how the hearing goes. The proposal is to leave that out. The taxpayer will eventually get those losses. They'll get the revenue back to them, that it's a timing issue. Instead of being able to go back and get it all of a sudden right now, one big lump sum, it'll be carried out in the future years for a little bit. The concern that the chairman shared was that we need to be careful that that's a one-time expense of $100 million or more. There's a discrepancy in the tax commission on how much it really is. The numbers are all over the place. So his concern was it was better to play it safe, knowing that the taxpayer was going to get the revenue, and it was better to have those revenues available because in the future you're going to see some more income tax reductions coming forward, and he would like to see us lower the overall rates in Idaho as one of the highest rates in the nation. And he's afraid that if we conform to that, it could impact the ability to lower the overall rates.
Representative Necochea, this loss carry issue, this idea of being able to capture that right now is kind of important to restaurants, particularly because of the losses that they've seen in the last year due to COVID. Can you speak a little bit to where the Democratic caucus is on this particular issue, which incidentally is important to many of our businesses?
Yeah, well, I can only speak for myself. I was pleased to see the proposal that Chairman Harris put forward today, because I think the businesses who have been able to benefit from that past due loss conformity it's a very narrow group, and I think you want to be cautious and make sure we're looking at across the state how conformity impacts all kinds of taxpayers. And the other piece is that it's just such a big revenue hit. Not only we know it's big, we don't know how big. So it's big and really hard to predict. The range was really wide as far as the that impacts what else we can do with our state budget if that's hanging out there and could potentially swing to something really wild. And conformity is important. It's important. What we want. Filing your taxes. I don't think we'll be able to do it on a postcard. We want it to be straightforward. And there are pieces in the study that I'm not crazy about. Just because the Fed do something doesn't get a good idea for Idaho. The so-called 3 martini lunch deduction is not something I'm crazy about. But I think we heard a conformity bill this morning that we can work from.
Fair enough. Continuing with you, Representative Necochea, and I'm sure Representative Moyle will have something to say about this as well, because he's been such a part of this process. But Idaho's tax code is really, for all intents and purposes, a flat tax. And while Representative Moyle is correct that we are at 6.9, which is some of the highest in the West, when you look at how the income tax code works, it's pretty much anybody making $20,000 or more is going to pay at the highest rate, which is 6.9% in the state of Idaho. What's your take on this? Do you see this as a problem, and what improvements could be made to change the tax code so that it better fit your vision?
Yeah. So I see it a little differently. Our income tax has been flatter, gradually over the years. The top rates cut and the top bracket kind of evaporate. But our income tax, it's far from flat, and that's a good thing. About half of our households, about half of the filers are below that top bracket. And you also have to, do that translation from what the wages are to taxable income. It's not. You have to do some calculations to figure out which bracket you fall into. Our sales tax and our property taxes are quite progressive. And so Idahoans facing lower wages pay a larger share of their income tax on the sales tax property tax than higher income Idahoans do. And so that's upside down. But because we have those phase-in steps to our income tax, we can ameliorate some of that inequity and those progressive taxes somewhat. But still, when you account for all state and local taxes and put it all together, we still have a regressive system where lower income households are paying a higher share of their income. Digging into the income tax specifically, we see that the people in that lowest 20% of earners have a negligible income tax bill, while the top 1%, put them all together, an average what they pay is about 4.6% of their income. So what I would like to see is, I don't think it makes sense that the top bracket is at an income level that is so low, still hitting the very middle of Idaho earners, and your marginal tax rate is the same whether your taxable income is $25,000, $50,000, or $2.5 million. I don't think that makes a lot of sense for Idaho. So I'm always looking for ways to make sure we're not taxing people into deeper poverty. Poverty has long-term costs when children experience it. Poverty is not good for the economy, because then people can't go to Main Street and do the things that contribute to a vibrant economy. And so I would like to see, some tax credits and things like that to help balance out our tax system.
You know, I know Representative Moyle, you'll speak to that, but I want to speak to the broader issue given our time constraints. You've been a big part of the larger tax scheme in the state of Idaho since you got to the legislature. And one of the things that I was there for that, in fact, I believe you and I both voted for was the ability to tax internet companies who make more than $100,000 in the state of Idaho income tax. At the time, we estimated that that pot was going to be worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $15 million to $30 million a year. And what we found, particularly as a result of the pandemic, is that in fact, there's about $150 million sitting in that account right now. I think $144 million sitting in that account. But nobody can access it right now because it got put into an account that was, quote unquote, to be used for future tax cuts. What do you intend to do with it, and what is your take on Idaho's income tax?
Well, let's start off maybe with the income tax side of your conversation there. You know, Idaho's economy is changing, and you're correct. When for years the tax on internet purchases was due and it wasn't going into the tax coffers of the state of Idaho because people weren't paying the use tax, so we did do that wayfare bill. But back to the income tax. Problem that Idaho has, our economy's changing. We have all these people that are moving in from out of state, and our economy is not building businesses. There's a disincentive to bring business to the state of Idaho because our income taxes are so high. And you're correct, Matt, that you know basically you make $20,000 in the upper bracket, and that's a concern. We've got to fix that. As for the wayfare money, the wayfare money is tied to sales tax, in my opinion. We put that money there to make sure it was protected so that all Idahoans could benefit from those revenues that were going to come in from items that weren't being taxed and should have. And now that we know that it's about 10 to 12 million a month, I think that those revenues need to be directed toward where they came from, which is sales tax. You'll see a bill to try to lower the overall sales tax rate through the state of Idaho by using that money, try to get it down as close as we can to 5. I think that that's where it came from with sales tax. There's a nexus with sales tax, and I think that we need to use that money to lower the overall rate for everybody on sales tax. So you'll see a bill that does that coming forward, I think, pretty soon. I think that when we did the wayfare bill, as you were there when we crafted that, the concern was if we didn't give it back to the taxpayers, that it would get caught up and spent in the stream of the government has. You know, they don't have a dollar they're not going to spend if we're not careful. And I think that it needs to go back to sales tax relief, and hopefully we can get that done this year.
Representative Necochea, continuing with the sales tax, one place where you and Representative Moyle have consistently landed in the same area is that the grocery tax credit is a really good way to deal with the revenue stream that comes in from travel and tourism and all the things that go with that, but still provide a refundable tax credit to our citizens who are in the city, in the state buying groceries. Explain your take on what needs to be done to improve the grocery tax credit. What are the challenges with it, and how does it impact our overall tax burden in the state of Idaho?
Right. So for anyone out there who's not familiar with your grocery tax credit, if you don't file your taxes on your own, this is something you get at the end of the year, and you get it. You know, everyone kind of gets the same amount, with seniors getting a little more. And if you don't file taxes, then you won't get it. But I don't think most people think about it that much. It just comes, and the intent was to sort of make up for what you pay for sales tax on your groceries the rest of the year. I think what's to like about the way we do that is that the sales tax on grocery is a stable revenue source, and that, you know, some of the funds come from out-of-state visitors who are here buying groceries, and you know, we always like to it seems more favorable to tax outsiders than residents a lot of the time. You know, a few years ago when I started researching this, you could see that the lowest income Idahoans were on average better off receiving that credit than having to pay the sales tax on groceries. You know, the dollars added up in their favor, but that picture changes over time. The grocery tax credit is fixed at a nominal amount and does not adjust as grocery costs rise. And today, almost all Idahoans would be better off financially if we did this swap, that is, repealing the sales tax from groceries, but also eliminating the grocery tax credit. That also means, because as if everyone wins, it also means it comes at a significant cost to the state. And so that's just important to look at. And that's also the concern I've had. There's a trade-off when you cut revenue between, you know, that revenue cutting policy and investments you want to make in education, arts, colleges and universities, healthcare, and other state services, broadband, for example, or other parts of infrastructure. And I also take issue with the fact that families who participate in SNAP, that's the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or food stamps, aren't eligible for the credit for any portion of the year in which they participate in SNAP, even when SNAP is not designed to cover your entire grocery bill. So they are still paying some sales tax on groceries, but they get nothing in terms of the grocery tax credit for those months. And these are the people who are experiencing the most financial hardship and are most at risk of, not being able to put food on the table. So I would like to see the grocery tax credit increased in a targeted way that puts more cash in the hands of the people who are struggling that balance between paying for food, paying the electric bill, putting gas in the car to get to work, etc. And when we can direct more dollars there, we can fuel our local economies.
Representative Moyle, you're an example of a representative who has been all over the board on this one that Representative Necochea is talking about. I mean, early on, you introduced legislation that would have repealed the grocery tax, but then it feels like you've kind of coalesced around the fact that the grocery tax credit has real benefits to Idahoans. And in fact, last year you brought legislation that would have increased the grocery tax credit with the speaker. A little bit about your take on it and how close in alignment are you and Representative Necochea?
Yeah, Matt, a few years ago I did introduce a bill that did away with the sales tax on food. It was tied to income tax reduction, because when you do that, that is it's called the food tax credit, is what it's called. But when you do away with the food tax credit, you do have an impact on the income tax side of individuals. But my attitude's changed a lot on that. Your elderly grandparents, if they're still alive, are doing better. They're not paying $120 a year, for example, in sales tax on food purchases for the most part. In fact, the AARP came out against taking away the credit because it does help the elderly. So it kind of morphed on that a little bit. I visited with some of our friends that own some, or are managers or higher up in some of the bigger food chains throughout the state of Idaho, and they all kind of said the same thing. For example, if you buy milk at the Albertsons downtown Boise versus the Albertsons in Eagle, the price is probably a little different, because each of those stores, for Albertsons, Walmart, I don't care who they are, they adjust their prices based on what people are willing to pay. So if you take sales tax off of food, I think there would be a decrease in your costs at the store for a while. But I think over time there would be movement within those prices where others would, where the prices could go back up, where you'd actually be a net loser. I actually have an individual that's a friend of mine very close to this building who owns some stores, and he flat out told me, man, if you move it by 6, everything I do is by 9. I make money on it. He was excited about taking sales tax off food. So my attitude started morphing. I started thinking, the best way is to get it to Idahoans. And when you do it through the food tax credit, it goes to Idahoans. There's $100+ million hole there, and that's because somebody else is paying that tax. And my favorite tax is one that somebody else pays and not Idahoans. And that's because we're a destination state. People come here to recreate. People come here to use our trails, to hunt, to fish. You name it. We've got, I've told, over 5 million people go through eastern Idaho on their way to Yellowstone, and they stop and they buy food and they buy stuff and they pay the tax. And so I think it's incumbent to keep the tax on those food purchases. But at the same time, I think it's incumbent on us to try to figure out a way to get the money back to Idahoans. That's why I think you're going to see some proposals this year to lower the overall rate, or try to find a way to give it back where we at least help our Idaho citizens as we go down the road of trying to figure out how to handle the credit and how to handle the issue of sales tax. Idaho sales tax rates, in my opinion, ought to be closer to 5. Idaho income tax rates ought to be closer to 5, and we're a lot higher than that on the income, and we're 6 on the sales. So those debates will happen, but I morphed because I think overall the credit was better for Idaho families than taking the sales tax off of food. And remember, when you go down that road, all of a sudden now you're making definitions. Some states, for example, a large marshmallow, it's food, but a little one's bait. So since it's fishing bait, you have to pay tax on the small marshmallow, but not the big one. And then we end up with a bunch of bureaucracy trying to figure out what's food and not food. It turns into a mess. So the food tax credit's a lot better way to handle it now, but I think we're trying to morph into lowering the overall rate in the future.
Talk a little bit about, and we didn't talk about this when you and I first had this conversation, but talk a little bit about the relationship between the corporate income tax and the personal income tax. Both are basically the same rate. And whenever the state legislature changes the income tax rates, they lower them together. And often that argument is around S Corp and LLCs. Can you help explain, Representative Moyle, your take on that and the kind of concurrent relationship between our income tax rates? And then we'll come back to you, Representative Necochea, with a conversation on that as well.
Yeah, Matt, you know, when I first got here, Idaho's income tax and their corporate tax were different. I think that when I first got here, the corporate was like 8.4 and the income was like 8.2. That's a long time ago. And through the years, it's been one of the big pushes. It's basically the only reason I ran for legislature. Our taxes are too high. You can call me a liar, but when you're in the top rate and you're only making $20,000 a year, that's a problem. There has been proposals in the past to decouple corporate from individual, and because some make the case that corporations, we could do it with the whole corporate tax and it'd be a good deal, and we could have zero corporate tax in the state of Idaho and it'd bring business here. Well, the first thing that would happen is that every individual you know is going to do all they can to move all their assets into a corporation to protect them from the income tax, so it doesn't make sense. So through the years, we found it wise to keep the corporate and individual the same rate. Makes it easier for individuals, and it also prevents from people playing games in regards to their taxes, and it's a fair way to handle it. But again, there are some today, even in a meeting I had this morning, that were proposing leaving the corporate higher and lowering the individual, trying to find a way to get the individual side down faster than the other. And last week, earlier this week, there was an individual who wanted to talk to me about taking all corporate off and leaving individual high. It just doesn't work. You're better off keeping them together.
Representative Necochea, your take on the corporate and personal income tax being essentially tied?
I mean, I think it makes sense for all the reasons, excuse me, Representative Moyle outlined. We don't need, to encourage people doing, fuzzy things of moving income back and forth and taking it out here versus there. We should, I think, treat it the same.
We're going to get into
Matt, there is a disadvantage, though. If we talk about our taxes, that's one of the reasons you always see pushing on those corporate individual income tax rates. Our income tax rates are too high. One of the first thing businesses do that come here or look at Idaho is look at your rates. And we have some great incentives. We've done some great things to incentivize business to come here. But once they're here and those incentives go away, they're on the hook. And we need to do something to keep them here or to incentivize them to come here. And that you've got to get the rates down low. They need to be closer to 5, not 7.
So, Representative Moyle, speaking of conformity, you have the conformity on the business side, which is the loss carry forward concerns that the business community has. But then after the Trump tax cuts, for the first time in Idaho's history, we essentially had to have a non-refundable child tax credit, because the way the federal tax reform went, families lost all of these deductions from the federal tax, which transferred to the Idaho tax. The net result of that was certain families ended up paying higher taxes, even with the non-refundable tax credit in the state of Idaho. So in essence, the federal tax cuts raised Idaho tax cuts. And in the lower income brackets, that was really impactful. Right now, the non-refundable child tax credit is $205. It's clearly not enough. At least that's what a lot of people feel from across the state. What's your take on that? Are we looking at increasing that as you lower the sales tax rate, or you increase the grocery tax? Because they are a bit related.
Well, if you increase the food credit, and food credit is tied, remember, every man, woman, and child, elderly 120, those under man, woman, child doesn't hold, they are $100 a person. And there was talk about that when we increased the credit, how that helps offset that. This year so far, I haven't heard it being brought forward. In fact, if you remember when we did that, Matt, we adjusted it twice. We did another adjustment higher up later in the year because we knew it needed to be higher. And we tried to find that sweet spot where we broke even, and that was the number that they informed us it was. It probably needs to be higher. I don't have a problem with raising it, but I think you can accomplish the same goals if you get the rates down overall. I think lowering the rates overall down will help accomplish the same goal as raising the credit. And I think that more benefit, and including the incentive, bring businesses here. Listen, my friend, our economy is changing. The people that are moving here are elderly. They're not bringing jobs. In my district, we figure almost 90% of the folks that are moving into the Eagle Star area are elderly or they are younger and retired, 50 plus retired. The number of children they have, last I saw, was less, is like 0.6 children. And they're not coming here to work, they're coming here to retire. And that's a concern. You drive around and see the growth that's going on there. We're building homes, we're building a few businesses, usually a bank. I mean, the other day I was looking, we got a bank, a car wash, and a new restaurant. Those aren't the kind of jobs we need to maintain our economy when the growth stops coming here. We need businesses coming here that create high-paying jobs. So as we look at that, I think we're better off focusing on getting the rates down and getting the businesses here that bring the jobs that we need to carry the economy in the future when this bubble of growth as people flee other states coming to Idaho to get away from the problems in those states. When that stops, we need to be in a position we have jobs for those folks.
Representative Necochea, let's get to the sticky widget of tax policy right now, which is property tax. And what Representative Moyle is talking about is that you've got senior citizens moving into residential areas, more expensive areas to retire. The amount of problems that is creating cannot be overstated, not the least of which is the rapid increase, sometimes doubling and tripling over a period of 6 months, the cost of residential housing inside of this, particularly the Treasure Valley, but that's happening up in Kootenai County. It's also happening in eastern Idaho. As you see it, what is the big issue and why are our residential property taxes going up so rapidly in the state of Idaho?
Well, Matt, I mean, you hit it on the head. Number one is, that growth is fueling these skyrocketing home prices. And so it really comes down to, and then that creates a shift. So we've got a tax shift and then we've got growth. To talk about the shift, for years we had a homeowner's exemption that went up with housing prices. And I am echoing a little bit, aren't I? My sound okay?
Yeah, you're fine. That's my fault.
Okay. So for years we had a homeowner's exemption that went up with home prices. The legislature capped that in 2016 at 100,000. If the legislature had not passed that bill and not capped it, the homeowner's exemption would be almost $150,000 today, as that's a dramatic difference. And we see it in the numbers and what we're hearing from residents in Ada County from 2016 to 2019. Commercial and residential properties are on two different, like I said, they're like on two different train tracks, moving further and further apart on these diverging paths. If you take the compounded percentage difference in taxes paid at the median since 2016, commercial properties had their taxes go up 1%, while for residential it was 28%. And it's accelerated in just the two most recent years where commercial property taxes went down 4.3% and homeowner taxes went up 11.5%. And that's simply not sustainable. We can't keep going down this path. And, a one-size-fits-all homeowners exemption probably doesn't make sense in this state. Home values are skyrocketing in some communities, but not in others. So increasing the homeowners exemption rapidly in a small, slow-growing county would create a big shift in the other direction, onto commercial. And I think the real goal really needs to be that commercial and residential properties move in tandem as much as possible. The bill I'm working on would have an annual adjustment based on the local home market changes, so that we can start to control for what's happening locally and try to maintain a fair balance over time. Second, on growth, we have a lot of older folks moving in, but we also have a lot of our families are growing as well. And West Ada School District is a prime example of that, where they're having to accommodate about 600 new students every year. And that's equivalent to a new large elementary school every year. And that costs money. We need to build that infrastructure. How do school districts build new schools? They pass bonds and get the money from every taxpayer in the district. And what we need to do is we need to ask developers to help us with this. When a developer builds a new subdivision, they ought to contribute proportionally to the new school construction that new growth will necessitate, just as they would contribute to other pieces of infrastructure, like the sewer system. I've heard anecdotally that developers coming from other states are actually incredulous at how little they have that we ask for in impact fees and how little they have to contribute to the infrastructure. So I think we have actually really broad support for doing something in the area of impact fees for school construction. And finally, if we funded education better at the state level, we wouldn't have so many of these so-called supplemental levies that schools just now rely on to hire teachers and to keep the lights on. And then we wouldn't have so many school districts, going to the taxpayers to ask for supplemental levies just for their operations. That's something we need to fund better at the state level.
The challenges, and you spoke about it in STAR, and I don't necessarily know the numbers in STAR, but what I do know is that residential property requires more infrastructure implementation for cities and municipalities to get into place because you have more citizens, more use of public services, etc. A place like Eagle is looking at a distribution between commercial and residential property of like 85% residential and 15% commercial. And CUNA is even worse right now. It's almost 90% residential. So as you look at all of this shift on,
Matt, have you got STAR's numbers on that?
I don't have STAR's number on that because I know you represent Eagle, so that's the one I went with. But your point,
and STAR.
Your take on this is budgets, and there's got to be explain that, and then tell us how we actually address that.
Well, let's start by talking about the homeowner's exemption a little bit. When we froze that, I would remind everybody that the homeowner's exemption had dropped. It was under $90,000. And there's been this change, and it kind of ties into what I talked about a few minutes ago, Matt. We've seen all this influx of homes, but not businesses. That's why I gave the example. I had a reporter with me the other day, and I took her around my district. It's been a little while back. And we drove around all the new subdivisions and all the homes and saw all of it, and it made a loop through Star and Eagle and around and came back down Highway 16, which needs to be stuck to the freeway sooner than later to help traffic on Chinden and State, but that's another story. So we got back, I asked her this question: how many businesses do you see? And her comment was she couldn't remember any. Well, there was 3. It was a restaurant, a bank, and a car wash. That's why I used it a minute ago. Well, the problem you have, and you gave a good example, if Eagle 85, I didn't know what theirs was, CUNA's 90. When I was with the mayor the other day, he said it was 96. 96% of the value were homes, with 4% in commercial. If you raise the homeowner's exemption, it does no good because there is nobody to shift it to. There's this perception that if you just keep raising the homeowner's exemption, your taxes are going to go down. Not the case. It's going to go to the unprotected portion of your home. It does not work. In fact, those who benefit the most with raising the homeowner's exemption are those with homes over $250,000. So in essence, you hurt those on the low end. So the low end is the ones that can least afford a tax increase or property tax increase, and that's what you're going to get to if you raise the homeowner's exemption. So there's got to be a better way. If you want to raise the homeowner's exemption, there is a way to do it to prevent that shift. Last year, the House passed a bill which would have raised the homeowner's exemption, but it took the value of that increase, the dollar amount, out of their budget. It took it away from their new construction and their 3%. By doing that, it did not shift it to the businesses and the unprotected portion of their homes. If we're going to keep building homes, raising the homeowner's exemption doesn't fix the question. I have always said and continue to say it's the budget. We like to talk about values of the homes. We like to talk about the increased values. We like to talk about the difference in values between commercial and residential. But ultimately, it comes down to what are the budgets? The budgets are the problem. And we've seen some tax districts do a good job on their budgets, and we've seen others that grab the 3%, the new construction, the annexation, change in classification. All of a sudden, homeowners are getting double-digit increases each year. And it's not the homeowner's problem or fault. It's the fault of those entities who are budgeting and spending the money. I've always thought that the increase in budget ought to somehow be correlated to inflation and population growth. And when you look at that chart, you look how fast inflation is growing, which is very low, and you look how fast the population is growing in Idaho, and then you look how fast property taxes are growing, they're through the roof. Somehow we've got to get it under control. You brought up something also in your comments, Matt. You talked about how homes cost a lot more and they need more services provided to them, and you're exactly right. Commercial pays more than its fair share, so does ag and other types of property than those that are in the residential area. But I would remind you, when you go see those new developments being built, who built the road to those developments? The developer did. Who put in the sewer lines and paid a fee to hook up to the sewer lines? The developer did. Who paid for the water lines and hookups for those water lines? The developer did. Who paid for the sidewalks? The developer did. Who paid for the parks in those areas? The developer did. Who paid for the landscaping? The developer did. And then when he's all done, and paid for all those improvements, the road improvements and everything else, who paid impact fees for roads? The developer did. Who paid impact fees for sewer, water? The developer did. Who paid impact fees in Star, at least, for fire? The developer did. Who paid impact fees for parks? The developer did. The cities aren't, and municipalities aren't paying those expenses. They're pushing them off on those developers, where they should be, in my opinion. They should be paying for those, and they should be paying those impacts. But the city then to come back and say, well, this growth is killing us, it doesn't work. It doesn't work for me, because the city gets to decide how much they're paying for sewer, how much they're paying for water. And in Ada County, you pay a higher registration fee for your vehicles, they'll pay for roads. So somewhere to fix this problem, when you go through all these different rabbit holes, you come back, the problem's the spending. Why can some cities do it so much cheaper than others and do the same job and provide the same services? You tell me. Why does Meridian do such a much better job than Nampa? You tell me. Same size city, taxes are much higher in Nampa than Meridian. So to get down that road, I ultimately think it comes back to the budget. I think we can do some stuff on the edges with the homeowners exemption, and I may bring a bill to do that this year, but I'm not going to let it shift to the other homeowners or to the homeowner's unprotected portion of their home. I want it to come out of the budget, because if you shift it, you have not fixed the problem. You made the problem worse, in fact. And to falsely try to tell somebody that we've fixed the problem because we raised an exemption that they're going to pay for, because 90% of the value in that district is homes, there's no way to shift it to, I think it's disingenuous and dishonest.
So what you're saying is that there's a balance between raising the homeowner's exemption in some modest ways to help manage the budgets. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that if you go back, we did not have the problem we have today with property taxes until 1996. And in 1996, they added the new construction component. Before that, it was just a flat, fixed, this is what it is. That's why you see the bill on the Senate. That bill today will be pulled back because it has an error in it. But it's basically a 3% with a variance up to 4% depending on the new construction. That's why you see that, because you slow it down. It's way higher than CPI and everything else. But yeah, if you don't somehow figure out how to control the spending at the same time as you work on the homeowners exemption or those other issues, you've accomplished nothing.
Representative Necochea, I'm a developer and I want to put in 1,000 new homes, and 1,000 new homes in a neighborhood, or 100 new homes, whatever it is, depending on the scale of the build. We know that a new police officer, just the employee, is $100,000 to get them in the door, and then $100,000 plus 2% every year moving on. Fire departments cost, and this isn't even taking into account the cars, the wheels, everything else. There's a huge argument that cities should be revenue-based. They get what they get, and then they provide the services based on what they get, versus the budget-based model, which tends to be the national model for cities and counties. Explain the difference on that, and explain your take on some of the challenges that we're facing with budgeting and taxes.
Sure. I think a lot of people think that, that your house is worth a certain amount, and then, the city or the county decides, like, this is the rate that everyone has to pay on the value, and it's actually backwards. Cities and counties set, they create a budget based on the services they want to provide, what they have to pay for law enforcement, the emergency responders, to run the library, whatever level of services they decide to set, and then working within this 3% limit, plus growth factors that we have in our statute. They can't, raise their budget any amount they want. We have these constraints in statute. Local governments can go to the max, or they cannot. And the city council members and county commissioners, these duly elected officials, have public meetings at which budgets are decided, and they set a budget, and then at the same time, what their assessors are figuring out what's the value of all of the property that will be taxed. And then, the budget is divided by the total taxable value out there, and that's how we back into a rate. If voters are unhappy with this level of services, if they find that they're too extravagant, they can go and testify against that. They can vote out their elected officials. If they find the services to be deficient, they can try to vote in different elected officials, but services also might be suffering because they're at their caps and they can't increase revenue anymore. I have constituents in the North Ada Fire District who are desperate for faster fire response. They're really scared that they're underprotected, but they're up against a limit, and so that's that. We heard testimony over this bill that would have frozen frozen local budgets for 1 year. During the last session, we heard days of testimony, and so much of it is seared into my brain from local officials from all political stripes, mostly conservative because we were a conservative state, but people who traveled all across the state to explain how just how limited they are and constrained they are. We heard from the mayor of Nampa that they're falling well short of the recommended number of law enforcement officers patrolling the streets. In Bannock County, the prosecutors were worried about having enough prosecutors to take care of child sexual abuse cases. In eastern Idaho, I heard from a county commissioner concerned about ambulance response, that with the freeze, they were going to have to reduce the number of emergency responders in an ambulance. If a patient crashed on the way to the hospital, they'd have to pull over to administer CPR instead of proceeding to the hospital. And that puts people's lives at risk. So I think, when it comes to local services, I think it's really important that we keep those decisions as close to communities as possible, and not use the heavy hand of the state to further mandate. We already have restrictions in place. I don't think we need to further mandate what communities can and can't do. And that's what the democratic process is about. People can hire different local officials if they think their budget is being mismanaged or services are inappropriate. So that's what I would say about that.
So, Representative Moyle, this is a big deal.
I got you. See, there's Mr. Freeze right there.
Yeah, right. You would argue that budget-based process is the problem, but then when you look at what Senator Rice's bill would do, if you think about the 2009 recession when people were turning homeless, the sales tax distribution had decreased dramatically because we were in such a bad recession, and the CPI had actually gone down to minus 0.36. So cities were taking a cut at the sales tax level. Then they would have had to do a cut at the property tax level, which and you know this, but I explain this because of other people that are watching. Your leading indicator of a recession often is sales tax. Secondary to that is the unemployment that ensues from that. So then your income tax takes a hit. And then lastly is the depression in the property market, as people are then eventually losing homes and things like that. So property tax is the most resilient tax for providing those absolute essential services, whether it be police, fire, etc. How do you get at creating something that still works, that is incentivizing the commercial growth that you're advocating for those cities, but doesn't strangle cities like Nampa? Because Boise's different, right? We replaced our mayor. New mayor said we're not going to take any of the increment, and then the new growth in Boise, because it's a more maturing city, was only 1.7%. So new construction was 1.7%. But in Nampa, new construction alone was almost 4%, because they're a burgeoning city and they're getting manufacturing and the Amazon, everything else. So talk a little bit about the complexities, and leave out the political rhetoric as much as you can.
Oh, come on, let me have fun. Listen, I heard all the crying last year about the freeze bill, and look at how many of the taxing districts froze or did like Boise should have been doing for years and cut back on their budgets. Nampa could do the same thing, and if Nampa's got a problem, they can cut back on the growth. They have the ability not to approve some of the stuff or slow road it, or to make them do a better job. Property taxes are a small portion. For example, in Nampa, I don't know what it is now. I think last year was around 24% of their overall budget. 24%. If you're telling me that cutting or capping the growth of 24% of their budget at 4% is going to somehow cause a crater in the earth, which didn't happen this last year when a lot of taxing districts froze their budgets, I'm going to tell you you're wrong. In fact, I'm going to tell you that little old lady on Social Security would love to have a 4% increase every year, and she's not getting it. And on the other side, you're requiring her to pay a 4% increase on her home. So I think 4% is reasonable. I think property taxes, we forget that it's not their whole budget. It's only a small portion of their budget. I think we forget, and you brought it up very well, Matt, is that we do share sales tax, but we also share alcohol tax. Did you know the alcohol tax was created as a way to lower property taxes? Look what that mess has turned into. It's not lowering property taxes, but a good chunk of that, most of it goes back to cities and counties. So the state, every time we've tried to reach out and try to solve the problems by sending general fund monies or alcohol money or sales tax money, or you name your revenue source here to try to alleviate the pressure on property tax, it hasn't worked out so well. So I think that if you look across the state, you see those that have shown that they can do it and handle it and provide services and do it well, and we've seen those that don't seem to be able to handle it. I'll use Nampa as an example. I don't know what it is now, but I used to be almost twice as much to provide the same services as Meridian for the property taxes in Meridian versus Nampa. That's a problem. Why the disparity? Why can Meridian do such a good job and Nampa do such a poor job? I don't know the answer to that. I haven't done their budgets. But I really firmly believe that they need to be part of the solution. Everything everybody wants to talk about is somehow how to shift the tax, like we talked about a minute ago, or how to raise the tax, or how to have somebody else pay the tax. But ultimately, you have to get to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is spending. So what's a reasonable amount of growth that they need on that small portion of their budgets? Remember, the property tax, like I said, in the cities around 20 or 25% of the budget. How do we get to that, constraining that portion that is driving our elderly out of their homes and causing the problem, while not doing harm to the cities, counties, and other taxing districts? And I think there's a way forward if we all work together. The problem we always have with property taxes, though, is that the legislature's never been able to solve it. The homeowners exemption was done with an initiative. The 1% initiative, which is basically Prop 13 from California, was done in 1878, done through an initiative. Everything we've had to do to fix property taxes in the past have always been done through the initiative process, because the legislature sits down here and fights. The cities come down, counties, others, and whine and cry about how the world's going to end, and we can't get anything done, and then you end up with an initiative. And I think the next initiative that's coming is going to be much, much, much worse on the cities and counties and other taxing districts than, say, a small 4% cap on some, which affects about only 85% of the taxing districts in the state would not be affected at all by that bill. I think it's a fair start, and it's not, and at the very least, it's not even modest. I mean, it's just a way to try to slow the growth. But the overall answer, I'm afraid, if we can't work together to find a solution, is going to be an initiative. Because as you've seen, Matt, you've been here when we've asked for solutions to the property tax problem. The only thing we hear is we need more, or make somebody else pay more, and that's not the answer. It's going to be fixed. If it's not fixed in the legislation, it'll be fixed in this year.
This question's for both of you, and then we're about at the end. But, the state puts a lot of mandates on local government, whether it be to provide a free and fair, equal education, public defenders. There's a host of things that are state mandates, and that's the tip of the iceberg in terms of what the state mandates to the counties and cities to be able to put into place. Should the state be held accountable for effectively funding those so that we can, in gist, eliminate that from the property tax rolls? I'll start with you, Representative Necochea.
You phrase that question in an interesting way. Should the state be held accountable? I'm not sure how we. No one's figured out how to hold the legislature accountable for a lot of things, but I think I have my sound echoing a little bit. But there are, when it comes to, if we do mandate that the counties, run our court system, and then we underfund public defense, or we, provide a new judge to a county, and then the county has to scramble and figure out, well, how do we build the courtroom and pay for all of the staff so that judge can actually hear cases. And, I think one thing that what's missing in this discussion is some real tangible measures of how we're doing in our services. We can talk about the money here, there, or my friend Mike likes to say, oh, well, we give the local governments, X dollars a year from the sales tax distribution. And so they should be happy. But if that's not enough money to get the job done, and then our Idahoans are suffering, and I can't remember the specific figures, but our child custody cases are so backed up that it can take over a year, which is, heart-wrenching and terrible for a family and terrible for a child to not know, which parent they're going to live with, and have, this strife and this conflict. So these services are important to people's lives, and we need to do them well. And I think the legislature should be doing much more, especially in the area of public defense and funding our courts. And then that would ease up, some of the pressure for all the other services that are decided more locally in terms of, the amount of officers we have patrolling, how fast our response, our ambulance response time is. But I also think, if we could measure those things, it would also help our residents understand, what their tax dollars are going for. I think they have a right to know when the budget goes up. It's because we want to make sure our ambulance response time is X minutes, and if it's slower than X minutes, then you have a less likely chance of surviving, your heart attack on the way to the hospital. So we need to make sure people really understand, what they're getting for their dollars and what the value is.
Representative Moyle.
Yeah, Matt, Lauren brings up a good point, and there may be an issue with the courts. I don't know. Fundamentally, though, we'll first have to get to the bottom of the issue, the bottom numbers, and figure out what the state is helping supplant or pay for and what they're not. And so, last year I asked for a number, and it was somewhere around 650 million that the state sends back to the local governments through sales tax, alcohol tax, income tax, all the different taxes to help pay for those mandates. But the question still remains, are we sending back enough? And we don't know that yet. We need to find out what those mandates are and what they cost. The one issue that Lauren does bring up that I think there may be an issue with is the courts. And I know there's some people working on it, trying to figure a way to make that and how we go forward. But before we answer the court question, I think we need to figure out where that other 600+ million is going first. Because every time we've tried to send state revenue back to accomplish the goal of lower property taxes, and that's what they've usually been, it's turned out to be not such a good deal for the state or the property taxpayer, because they're paying for those revenues through their income or sales tax on the other side too. So looking forward, I think we need to get the bottom line of what those mandates are. I think we need to get the bottom line of what it costs, and the bottom line of exactly how much the state's sending back to see, what the real numbers are and how far the state is off on providing the help needed for those services that are being provided. The problem you have is you have two Idahos, and so we have to be careful too that we take care of our rural friends, but at the same time, I think that our rural friends are helping us on our urban issues also. So there's a balance there.
There's one question. We're at about an hour, and I know you two have committee and probably want to cram an apple down your throat after we're done here. But there is a question about the lottery income. The lottery is really to fund education. It's turned out it funds a little bit, but we thought it might be more in terms of what was going to it. So Representative Moyle is right. There are a lot of different funds that are feeding into the cities, but Representative Necochea makes a great point that we don't know how much of that actually is accomplishing what it's supposed to accomplish. Tax is a really complex issue, and I want to thank you both for talking about your vision, helping explain some of these nuanced issues and the relationships. I also want to thank you too for demonstrating what our legislature really can be and is a lot of the time, and that is demonstrating that different views can operate civilly and maybe come to some compromise over time. I recognize that a lot of the legislature is about how many votes you have, but Representative Moyle, thank you for being here. Thanks and Representative Necochea, thank you both for being civil. The Boise Metro thanks you. And last but not least, I want to thank the Idaho Statesman and Idaho Ed News for their continued commitment to helping us get the word out and having these conversations, hopefully in an unbiased and civil way. So thank you all. We'll be back on February 10th with two freshman senators, Senator Peter Rigg and Senator Ali Rabi. They're the two youngest members of the Senate, and they both are first-year senators from North Idaho and from the Boise Valley. It should be a good conversation. Thanks again, Representative Moyle. Thank you, Representative Necochea, and we'll see you all on the other side.
Thank you both.